My name is Guy Alberghini. This is a broadcast of the United States Constitution. Each broadcast will cover a very small section of the Constitution, policies that go against that section of the Constitution, as well as possible solution or solutions. If you just go along with the bad policies, then you agree with them. And if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Welcome back to the broadcast. My name is Guy Alberghini, the second broadcast of the year. Here again with Bill Fergerson. Hi, Bill. Bill with the Larouche PAC, Schiller Institute, and Executive Intelligence Review. How's it going, Bill?
It's good. Let me just clarify. It's the Larouche organization.
Okay.
Yeah, and Schiller
What did they say,
Institute.
PAC?
Yeah, you said Larouche PAC.
Okay.
That's the old one.
Yes.
But thanks for having me back.
Welcome. So, what would you like to discuss?
Well, let's talk again about what has to happen, what we have to make happen with regard to the incoming Trump administration. I don't know exactly which day this is going to get played, but we've got a lot of work to do.
This would probably be like early to mid next week.
Okay. So by then, his inauguration should be a success. We have to make sure the presidency is a success. Aside from the issues that we discussed about rebuilding the U.S. economy through a nationalized Federal Reserve, we're going to have to address the issue of global security. Now, I think the best way to think about it is to reflect on the fact that 250 years ago, the American colonies began a war that led to the creation of the United States of America against British colonialism. And in 1783, we were victorious. And then we established a constitution based on the principle of the general welfare of the citizens of the United States. As part of the declaration that followed in 1776, the beginning of that war in April 1775, 250 years ago, in the declaration, it states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted by the consent of the governed, and so on. Now, this principle has to be implemented on a global scale. What is come to be known as the global majority or the global South, led by the countries of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they have made it clear that they're not going to tolerate neocolonialism. They're not going to tolerate having their countries be used as sources of raw materials with no investment in the progress and development of their peoples. Now, this is the big fight globally. It's expressed in numerous ways. People may think that what's happening in Ukraine is something between Russia and Ukraine. But in fact, it is a result of the expansion of the Western powers, of NATO most particularly, to try to contain Russia. If you remember Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history in the 90s, if you remember all the discussion about how we won the Cold War, how Russia was no longer, the Soviet Union having collapsed, that Russia was no longer a superpower, but a gas station masquerading as a country. All of that foolishness got swept away. Now we have Russia that has been working to establish, in conjunction with China and India and Brazil and South Africa, you now have an alliance that also includes Egypt. It includes Iran. It kind of includes Saudi Arabia, although they're kind of on the fence. They haven't completed their formal alliance. United Arab Emirates, and then recently Indonesia. I don't know if people know that, but that's fourth largest population country in the world.
Mm.
They are now part of BRICS. And people need to understand that BRICS is not a threat to the West. It is not a threat to the United States. It is not a threat to the American people. BRICS is a threat to the financial oligarchs, the people that the financial powers behind the military industrial complex, behind the speculators that have turned the world financial system into a giant casino, the ones that give the orders that get the Federal Reserve to pump trillions of dollars. I believe the figure was something like $14 trillion between 2008 up to the present, to maintain this corrupt system that doesn't finance development. And China's taken the lead. If you look at the history of China, since 1989, they've lifted over 800 million people out of poverty. They created the Belt and Road transportation infrastructure system, working with 110 countries, putting up billions of dollars of investment to build rail infrastructure, maritime infrastructure, roads, and to engage in investment in thousands of industries. I remember about 5 years ago, I read a report by a company, I think it was called McKinsey, I'm not sure, but they reported on something like 10,000 factories that the Chinese had built and invested in Africa. If you look at this period where the U.S. Institutions are spending $14 trillion bailing out banks, the Chinese spent about the same amount, equivalent of $14 trillion, building up world economic infrastructure. They've had a growth rate, a GDP and industrial growth rate of about 8% a year. 30% of the growth in the world economy that's occurred since, I think, 2020 has come in China, whereas the growth rate, if you want to call it that, in the United States has been 2%. And why is that? Because the trillions of dollars that the U.S. created out of thin air with the Federal Reserve, they went to bail out banks. What did the banks do? I mean, if you look at the figures from like 2008, 2016, there was a correlation between the amount of loans that the banks were lending out to the real economy in the United States and the amount of credit that they got from the Fed. But now if you look at the figures in the last 4 years, there's been a vast amount of money going to these banks through the Fed, and almost none of it has been invested in building up the actual real physical economy of the United States. Those people are the enemy, not the BRICS. Now, this has come to get us into a confrontation, the United States, NATO, whoever you want to say, with Russia. I mean, we've seen it in the blowing up of the pipeline, the billions of dollars of weapons and cash sent to Ukraine to prop up an unelected or questionably elected government that was put in power by a coup by the United States and Britain to create a crisis on the border with Russia. The intention of these financial powers after the fall of the Soviet Union was to break Russia up into pieces that they could control, to make it a source of raw materials, just as the United States was to Britain at the time of the revolution. That's their intent for Russia, and they haven't given it up. And the Russians have resisted it. If you think back to December of 2021, Putin attempted many times in Alaska and in other international meetings to get in the same room with Biden to work out an agreement to halt NATO expansion into Ukraine. And Biden consistently refused to meet with him to work out an agreement to not have Ukraine join NATO and to get a new framework of security. The result of this being increased bombing and shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk in February of 2022, which finally, after 8 years of trying to keep this below the level of a war, the Russians moved in and began their fight. Now, you may recall the special military operation. Within a week of it beginning, Putin was talking to Zelensky to negotiate a peace agreement, a ceasefire, and a resolution of the conflict. But they brought Boris Johnson in to make sure that there was no agreement, no solution, and all aid coming from the West was contingent on Zelensky perpetuating the war. And now we have a result of who knows how many Ukrainians. I've seen estimates as high as 1 million Ukrainians dead as a result of this war that could have been stopped within the first 2 weeks.
I've seen reports that Zelensky was told many times not to negotiate, to just keep the meat grinder going.
Yeah, and in these last weeks of the so-called Biden administration, doesn't mean he's running the show, but he's the figurehead. Ukraine has come under increased pressure to lower their draft age down to 18. They haven't killed enough of their young population. So now they want to put 500,000 teenagers and other young people into the cauldron to be slaughtered. This is not what Ukrainians want. You can see there's hundreds of videos that Ukrainians make of kids being kidnapped off the street to be dragooned to go to the front against Russia to die. This is not what the Ukrainians want, but why does that surprise anyone? This government wasn't what the Ukrainians wanted back in 2014.
Yeah.
That was imposed on them for the purpose to attack Russia, to weaken Russia. And you've seen operations like that in Georgia. You've seen operations like that in other parts of the former Soviet Union to try to break up Russia and break up its alliances and weaken it. They're not putting up with it. Now, the immediate danger is that this could lead to a nuclear exchange, a nuclear war. We had this lunatic Admiral Thomas Buchanan talking about how if we're going to have a nuclear war, we have to make sure the United States is going to win it and has favorable terms for dominance after the nuclear war. I think he missed the memo about what nuclear war means.
Right.
There's no survivors. There's no dominating afterwards. But you've got lunatics like this in the government, at least for the next week. So how do we deal with this? Well, I should also address the Southwest Asia. We had the October 7 attack in 2023, and the response to it, which has been an attempt to wipe out the Palestinian population in Gaza. We've all seen the pictures, the videotapes. We've seen a population that was 50% children, and mostly children and women and elderly being exterminated by the Israeli military. And we have put up the money for this. We have supplied all the bombs and weapons for this. This has to end. We're now hearing that there's going to be a ceasefire ironed out before the Trump administration gets in. Well, that would be a good sign, but we have to make sure that the policy of the Trump administration is not genocide behind Netanyahu. There's also the fact that Netanyahu has been angling for decades to get the United States in a war with Iran. That absolutely has to be prevented. But it's all part of this global fight to end colonialism. And the United States has to get on the right side of that fight. Now, like I said at the beginning, Trump said the United States and China together can solve all the world's problems. That has to be our outlook. The United States should be working with the BRICS. I had mentioned in the previous interview I did with you about how the Federal Reserve could be nationalized to finance infrastructure, scientific progress, and industry and
Yes.
scientific investment in the United States. But that's only part of the story. If you think back to what FDR said to Churchill in the closing months of World War II, that the United States would no longer never again fight a war to save the British Empire, that the United States would use 20th century American methods to invest in the raising of the industrial capability, the productivity, the living standards of the former colonies. That has to be the perspective of the United States once again.
And that was JFK's vision too for the world.
Right. Atoms for Peace, the Peace Corps, that was the motivating idea in the Kennedy administration. Sorry, something. That's my Snowden shield.
Yeah, so back to the BRICS briefly. It was a while ago, but I saw a report that about 60% of the world population is part of the BRICS system.
That's right.
It's probably a bit higher than that now.
Well, with Indonesia, yes. And the thing about it is, the United States, with its anti-colonial history, should be joining with the BRICS. Now, just as we can turn the Federal Reserve into a mechanism for financing the redevelopment and reconstruction of the internal United States, we can do the same on a global level. If you remember Larouche's policy called the New Bretton Woods, hearkening back to the idea of the first Bretton Woods that was organized by FDR, we can create a new financial system that finances progress. In one of the interviews I did with you last year, I talked about Helga Zepp Larouche's 10 principles for new development architecture, global security and development architecture. I don't think I have time to go through all the 10 principles, but
Okay.
the key to it, the first principle was that this architecture has to consist of agreements between perfectly sovereign, independent states. No dictating, no rules-based order imposed by people who never follow the rules. The second point of her 10 principles was that you had to have a plan for global poverty alleviation. Now, how do you do that? Also, modern health systems to increase life expectancy worldwide, universal education, infrastructure development of all the continents, and an end to geopolitics. Now, to do all of that, you need financing. So you need a new financial system, an international financial reorganization. Everybody knows that that's the way business operates. You convince the lender to lend you funds so that you can buy the materials and hire the personnel to engage in the process to create more wealth than that loan represents. So you can pay the loan back so that you can raise productivity. That's what actual businesses do. That's what countries do for progress. This is what has to be done in the countries of the global South. Now, we just put out, I know this is going to be backwards, but this pamphlet, I don't know if you can see that. We put out this pamphlet. It's entitled Development Drive Means Billions of New Jobs, No Refugees, No War.
Mhm.
If we invested, for example, in the Bioceanic Rail Corridor project, that's a rail to go across from Peru all the way across Brazil and South America to connect the ports, the port of Santos on the Atlantic coast of Brazil to the Chancay port, which was just opened in Peru. That's the kind of investment project that will rapidly increase the living standard and wealth in South America. Another example would be the Nicaragua Grand Canal. That's a project that the Chinese have been trying to get off the ground for years to replace it, well, not to add to the Panama Canal.
Yeah, and for bigger ships.
Yes, for bigger ships, a great increase in the amount of maritime industrial traffic. In Africa, Africa has a population of 1.5 billion people. More than 500 million people, I think the figure is about 600 million people in Africa, have no access to electricity. How much could we, how many jobs could we create in the United States producing the equipment to build the nuclear plants that Africa needs? There's projects. There's a non-nuclear project called the Grand Inga Dam. There's already a couple of hydroelectric stations there. I think the ultimate plan would be to build 6 of them that could create 40 billion watts of electricity for Africa. There's a plan that was proposed by an Italian company back, I forget how many decades ago, called Transaqua. This is a plan to divert the water from the Congo River into Lake Chad, the depression, which used to be Lake Chad, which is almost dried up. So you could pump that water into to recharge the lake, creating a environment of progress for over 50 million people in Central Africa. Right now, the whole continent of Africa, 1.5 billion people, there's one operating nuclear power plant in South Africa. Egypt's about to get 2 built by Russia. But how much business could we do in Africa building power plants, building dams, building railroads? Why should China have all the fun to rebuild Africa? This is what the United States should be doing. And I'll just
And if
mention,
the United States actually developed other nations instead of trying to tear them apart, those other nations wouldn't be trying to leave the dollar and go to the BRICS necessarily,
yeah, well, I mean,
because
that's
they
just,
know that America has the best interest at heart also.
yeah, that would be in keeping with our revolutionary anti-colonial history. I just mentioned one other project. I think I've spoken about this before. There's going to be no hope for Southwest Asia, or as many people call it, the Middle East, unless the nations of Israel and Palestine, there has to be a Palestinian state, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, they're going to have to be able to live together without killing each other. And the
What
best
was
way to
the
do that,
what was the proposed development project for that area?
it's
Again,
called it is called the Oasis Plan. It also involves building artificial rivers, connecting the Dead Sea and the Red Sea with canals, massive nuclear power for desalinization. It has tremendous potential. for creating an economic boom that all people in that region can share in. Unfortunately, you haven't had leaders in that part of the world that could respond to that vision, that plan that was proposed by Larouche in 1975. I'm thinking in particular of people of the caliber of Yitzhak Rabin, who tried to make peace and was assassinated for it. But this has got to be the heart of the foreign policy of this Trump administration. I remember that in 2017, a lot of people's eyebrows were raised when Helga Zepp-LaRouche said that Trump had the potential to be one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. Well, if he does this, if he forms an alliance with the BRICS to rebuild the world economy, to bring, instead of just 800 million people out of poverty, to bring 6 billion people out of poverty, then he will be one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. But we can't sit and wait to see what he does. We have to make sure as citizens that he does that on our behalf. So we need to be active. We need to educate ourselves into these kind of projects, what kind of economic policy to pursue. So I invite people to get in contact with us, to use the websites for the information. I have my email there if anybody wants to get in touch with our activities in the Massachusetts, New England area. And since we're running out of time, I want to thank you for having me on.
Yes, so share this recording with everyone you know. If you see it on YouTube, subscribe. The YouTube channel's Guy Alberghini. If you just go along with the bad policies, then you agree with them. And if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So become part of the solution. Thank you, Bill, for being here again, and see you next broadcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching this broadcast. As it says at the beginning of the preamble, we the people. That's you, that's myself. Are you part of the solution or part of the problem? One way to tell is if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. So call, email, meet with your reps and senators, local leaders, tell them what they should be doing. They govern with the consent of the governed, and if you don't tell them what to do, it's implied that you agree with them and they're doing what you want them to do. So thank you very much again, and look forward to seeing you in the next broadcast.